Welcome to everybody to the fifth session of the eighth series sponsored by the Congregational Care Steering Committee. We've been moving from questions raised about what is known about a pandemic and what we still don't know. And those two sessions have been recorded and are available on our website or the blast sent out on Saturday. We've also been looking at how people of faith have faced pandemics and plagues in the past, the biblical and theological narratives, for example, history of recent epidemics in our country, and today in Tennessee and Nashville. And these sessions also are or will be available for review on our website or the blast sent out on Saturdays. Next Sunday, there will be no class. For the 3 Sunday sessions in December, we hope you will join us to look at how members of our congregation have been challenged by the pandemic, how our congregational care task groups are functioning, and finally, what we need to do to be better supportive of our ministries, whatever they be, in our congregation. We hope to hear from many of you. We really need to hear your voices, and especially we need your support. Let's begin with a prayer. O one who has promised to hold us in your care, we pause to give you thanks for all those who seek to meet the challenges of this pandemic with a reflection of your care. The nurses and doctors who have put their own lives at risk for the sake of the ill, the frontline workers who have extended their energies to protect our basic needs, the grandparents, parents, and child care providers who have shielded our youth, the teachers and researchers who labor to keep our hearts and minds seeking truth, the clergy and staff who keep the stories of your love and the challenges of caring for the vulnerable before us. And for all of those who quietly work in the largest and smallest of ways to be your disciples. Now help us open our hearts and minds to your will. Open our ears and our mouths to your word. Strengthen our courage and calm our fears as we pray in the name of our Lord, Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, she really needs no introduction, but it's my great pleasure at least to go through the formality of introducing one of our own who's repeatedly brought us insight since she and Ray became members of Westminster way back in the 1970s. So Dr. Carol Busse, who is professor of history at Volunteer State Community College and is Davidson County historian, zoom away.
It's a great honor to be with all of you today. And I really am delighted to be here to share some of the knowledge I have gained over the year about epidemics here in Nashville. And I have a few slides. You'll see that for those of you who have heard me speak before, I usually don't have these fancy backdrops, but I'm trying to summon my inner Donovan Drake this morning and have perhaps not a clever set of slides, but at least some interesting ones that I hope you will enjoy today. I want to say, first of all, epidemics have been here for pretty much ever. They're certainly biblical, but the first epidemics that came sweeping across North America were brought by the Spanish who came with Columbus and then thereafter. And historians estimate that from 75 to 90% of the population of native tribes here in North America were pretty destroyed by those virgin soil epidemics that Alfred Crosby, a historian, wrote about several years ago, and people began calling that the Columbian Exchange. So clearly by the time the European settlers came in here to Tennessee, there was a much smaller population of native people that had been here before the day of Columbus's arrival and the coming of the Spanish. And the tribes all the time were regrouping, recongregating, refiguring themselves because of a variety of things that happened to them. No tribe was any better at adapting to what the Europeans contact meant for them than the Cherokees. And so for that reason, it's particularly tragic that they who tried the most to compromise and make allowances and live with the settlers ultimately were forced to give up their native lands here in Tennessee. And I don't want to spend too much time on that because I've got 2 or 3 big epidemics here in Tennessee history that I really want to share with you. The first epidemic of the settlers took place before they ever got here. You know the story. I'm sure all of you know the story of the settlement of Nashville with James Robertson and a small group of men coming up through Kentucky and down through the center of Kentucky to this salt lick that had been identified on the Cumberland River. Women and children were put on flatboats, somewhat similar to this one, we expect. They were basically just rafts. They had no keel. They were maneuvered by poling. It was very slow going, particularly upstream, which they had to do. But they had really not gotten hardly out of Tennessee. Imagine where Kingsport, Tennessee is on a map, and start coming down towards Knoxville. You'll be on, I guess that's the Holston River, and you'll be on the Holston River where it turns into the Cumberland when it joins the French Broad right there in Knoxville. And then you'll be coming down through the western side of the Appalachian Mountains to just a little bit west of Chattanooga, that area that you cross on the interstate when you're driving to Chattanooga, the Nickajack area, and then dipping down into what is now Alabama and going through that Muscle Shoals area. Then you're still floating with the current, but when you get to the Ohio River in Kentucky, from there to here, it is upstream. Now, what a courageous voyage this was for these people, particularly all of these women who had their children with them, and many of their husbands were with the James Robertson party. So one of these women was Mrs. Jennings. We know about Mrs. Jennings' situation because it was written in John Donaldson's journal, which he kept and later edited, or some of his relatives edited after he was deceased. But John Donaldson, the leader of this flotilla of flatboats, wrote about what happened along the way. And along the way, Mrs. Jennings and her children developed smallpox. And of course, smallpox was an incredibly deadly disease. And the other people on the flatboats, there were 24, 25, 26, you read different numbers about how many flatboats they were, depending on what you read. But they abandoned Mrs. Jennings and her children and their flatboat down probably a little bit south of the Tennessee-Alabama border, and Mr. Donaldson, Captain Donaldson, wrote that they could hear their screams throughout the night. So they had to make some very difficult decisions when they first came. But indeed, they did make it. They got here. By 1804, not only was Nashville a booming city for a frontier town, but Tennessee had become a state, and the heart of the city was downtown, right where the Metro Courthouse is today. We had a public market, we had some businesses going, and a school had been created for the children. These people were primarily Scots-Irish, they were Presbyterian, but let me assure you, they did not build a church when they got here. They were people of faith, but the first thing they wanted was a school for their children. And so they established Davidson Academy, which wasn't right here in the downtown area. It was, I would say, northeast Madison area where the Spring Hill Cemetery is today. That's where Davidson Academy was. And so this town is settled. They have gotten a little bit of an established situation and a little bit of order here, and things look like they're on the move. Most of these people were land speculators, but they always had to be worried about epidemics and what would come through next. And indeed, they did come with great regularity. Probably the thing that was most dreaded after smallpox, and keep in mind, we had a smallpox vaccination. You'll remember that Cotton Mather, a minister of that early era in U.S. history, colonial history, actually had himself vaccinated, as did Abigail Adams have her children vaccinated while her husband John was away. So we did have a vaccination for smallpox, but cholera was probably the most deadly disease that came around. And this disease took so long for us to understand. We just couldn't understand what it was and how it spread. So it comes through very early, 1833. The newspapers list all of the people who have died in this 1833 epidemic, including newspaper editors, bankers, merchants, children, slaves, prisoners of victims of the disease. It was a terrible, terrible epidemic. Because the people of Nashville were so interested in education, even though Davidson Academy struggled throughout its entire history, becoming Cumberland College, and then it struggled some more when it became Cumberland College, the city decided they needed to really make this struggling college a first-rate national educational institution. And this probably, as much as anything, this decision to really focus on building the University of Nashville, probably as much as anything, helped our understanding of public health before other towns in Tennessee. They chose to be their president, Philip Lindsley. Philip Lindsley was a professor at Princeton. He was a Presbyterian minister. He was serving as acting president of Princeton University when he was called to be the president of the University of Nashville and to rebuild it and rejuvenate it. And he came to town, and he really did, in fact, make Nashville the Athens of the West. That was what he called Nashville, the Athens of the West. And he really indeed did accomplish that. So among the many things that he did was recruit a first-rate faculty, a very diverse faculty, and then he created a medical school for the university. And it trained doctors. It had some leading physicians on its faculty who were here in Nashville, one of which happened to be his son, Dr. Lindsley's son, John Berrien Lindsley, whom you see here. He became the head of this medical school. And so Nashville had excellent medical care. We have a long tradition in excellent medical care here. But cholera was a mystery to us. And if you go out to the city cemetery, or for that matter, any cemetery that was used extensively before the Civil War, you see all of these women and children who are buried there. And most of what we know about the various cholera epidemics before the Civil War came from the city cemetery records. So we're very fortunate to have the names of the people who died, the cause of death, the date of death, their age, because we can glean a lot of information just from the cemetery's interment records, which truly are fascinating. So Nashville ultimately gets picked to be the capital of the state of Tennessee. in, I guess, 1843 that took place. And again, the city hires a first-rate, the state of Tennessee, not Nashville. They hire a first-rate architect to come in, William Strickland, and design our beautiful capital. Now, Nashville is really a thriving center of commerce. We are a hub because of the access to the Cumberland River. We also have a tremendous amount of trade going in and out, agricultural as well as otherwise, and we were an important banking center in the South as well. Now, here is one of our, I guess I would call these our power couples here in Nashville. This is James Kay and Sarah Childress Polk. Mrs. Polk was a very strong woman of faith, a member of what is now the Downtown Presbyterian Church, but the First Presbyterian Church. President Polk became president in 1845. He was sworn in as president in 1845. He was always a very frail man, and he had campaigned on the promise that if he elected, he would only serve one term, and indeed he held to that promise. So as plans were made to return to Nashville, they bought a house which was arguably, at least according to Ridley Wills, and I think this is true, just the few pictures I've ever seen of this house, they bought the house of Felix Grundy, who had been a lawyer, a senator, a land speculator, done all sorts of things, but he was also sort of a mentor for President Polk. And so the Polks decide, after the successor, Zachary Taylor, is sworn in as president, the Polks decide to return to Nashville and make this their permanent home. He was still quite young, but his health had always been frail since he was a child. He had had a hernia operation. If you've read John Siegenthaler's little biography of James K. Polk, he talks about this. And he was always a very frail man. And Sarah Childress Polk devoted much of her life to his physical care, making sure he was healthy enough to perform his duties. So the way that they came to Nashville when they left Washington was not back across the Appalachian Mountains, but they came by boat around Florida up to the port of New Orleans. And at the New Orleans, it appeared that President Polk was very sick, but they made it to Memphis and then they made it on to Nashville. So they arrived here in the midst of a cholera epidemic. President Polk died. Now, one of the many things that many people believed about the spread of disease was that it spread, contagious diseases spread from corpses, from the deceased. And so the city had an ordinance that anyone who died of cholera had to be buried within 24 hours. And so President Polk had no place to be buried. He had not, as they say, bought a cemetery plot or reserved a space in a columbarium, which was non-existent at that time. And he was buried the day after he died in 1849 in Felix Grundy's family plot at the Nashville City Cemetery. And this was a terrible, terrible epidemic in 1848 and 49, but there was another equally bad one in 1853. And again, we just couldn't figure out what caused it. Now we know that it was from drinking impure water. We had heavy rains in a spring, the water table would rise, and as the water table rose, it got contaminated with groundwater and sewage. We had no sanitation system of any kind, and people got sick and died. Here is an 1853 newspaper account of the people who died. And again, this reads like the cemetery ledgers. Here we have Peter, a slave, dying. We have Mrs. Green, and we have somebody from the country, meaning rural Tennessee. But you see, the Tennessean ran the names of these people as long, and they would continue doing this as long as the cholera epidemic existed. Now, imagine what is the number we have in the paper just this morning. I saw the chart this morning, and what if we did this of the names of all of the people who have gotten sick from COVID or have died of COVID. Now, appearing on the scene, because of the University of Nashville was a very fine medical school, appearing on the scene is William King Bowling. Yes, Bowling Avenue, which some of you know where that is, was named for him. And so he writes a book about cholera after the Civil War. He certainly, during the Civil War, there were measles and mumps and all sorts of things spreading from both the Union and Army camps. But Dr. Bowling takes himself to be an expert on cholera, and he has determined this. You can actually find on the internet, and you can read it on the internet if you are of such a mind to do. But he is very interested in cholera, and he has drawn the theory that it has nothing to do with germs, but it is your diet. And so Dr. Bowling here comes up with this cholera diet that he tries to get people to follow. And it's a fascinating piece of work of the things that people were supposed to eat, but not it. What they ate didn't really kill them, but it didn't cure them of cholera either. Now, the big epidemics that come along, and cholera is still going on, especially in rural Tennessee, as late as the 1890s. Clinton is over in Anderson County, Tennessee, that's Oak Ridge, and as late as 1892, they are having a cholera epidemic, and they're saying it has come through Europe, it's come over here. So they thought cholera was spread like other contagious diseases. Let's just take COVID-19 for an example. Now, the biggest epidemics of all time that took place in Tennessee were the yellow fever epidemics that hit Memphis. We had yellow fever epidemics in Chattanooga and some other river towns from time to time, but none had the devastating effects of two in particular that hit Memphis. Memphis, right there on the Mississippi River, lots of tributaries to the Mississippi weave around through Shelby County. And these epidemics were totally shocking to the people of Memphis. The sheer magnitude of these epidemics that hit Memphis were totally shocking to the people. They didn't have the resources or the knowledge as to how to treat them. So many people during these two epidemics left the city of Memphis and never really returned. Those who stayed had a high percentage of mortality from these epidemics. The one in 1878 was particularly devastating for the people of Memphis because it hit so many people and it hit so rapidly. The population of Memphis in 1878 was probably about 45,000, and they had 25,000 people flee the city to get out, and those who remained either had to take care of the dead, bury the dead, or they themselves ended up getting sick, as did many of these people, such as these nuns who, without fear, took care of the people who were sick and dying. They set up a board of health down on the Mississippi River, trying to make sure to sanitize in some way boats that were coming in. They really had not quite figured out that it was the mosquitoes. And so they did begin disinfecting, meaning washing the streets of Memphis, thinking that human waste might be somewhat of a cause of this, and excrement from the pigs and cows that ran loose in the street, to say nothing of the horses. But the disinfectant didn't really make much of a difference, except to kind of calm the dirt down, I suppose, as much as anything. We've got some pictures that I don't have here with me today, but as in the 1940s, the TVA was doing what amounted to crop dusting over some of our rivers to kill insects that were spreading disease and other things. So we are not participating in that habit anymore. But during this 1878 epidemic, there were about 200 deaths a day in Memphis alone, to say nothing of the towns up and down the river, north and south of Memphis. When people died, the burial cart, the funeral cart would come through the streets of the city on a daily basis. They would be dragged into the streets. Sometimes the bodies were burned if the wagons didn't get there. And 16 Catholic priests who stayed and nursed the sick died, as well as 30 nuns. They were heroines of this terrible, terrible epidemic. People are leaving town, as I said. They are terrified for their lives. Now, the woman who really gets the notoriety for being the heroine of all heroines during this epidemic of 1878 was Annie Cook. Annie Cook was a businesswoman. She had come to town in 1872 and opened her business, which was a very successful brothel. So when this epidemic started spreading through the city and all her employees left as fast as they could, she opened her house to be a hospital. She took care of the sick there in her hospital, largely by herself, but with a little bit of help from time to time, before the disease actually took her life. And this story really made a lot of news, not only in Tennessee, but around the country. And particularly, religious people took her as an example of a person who could be redeemed, who could be saved, if you want to use that language for her. The story really touched people's heart that she could have left the city, and she chose to stay for no reason except to be somewhat of a caregiver to people who were in great distress. So in the the Memphis Appeal was the name of the newspaper at that time. There was a very lovely eulogy about Annie Cook. It said, Annie Cook, the woman who, after a long life of shame, ventured all she had of her life and property for the sick, died September 11th of yellow fever. Surely the sins of this woman must have been forgiven for her faith hath made her whole. You know where that verse came from. Made her one of the loving Christ, whose example she followed in giving her life that others might live. So this stone was put into the Elmwood Cemetery. There's a big section of the Elmwood Cemetery. Those of you who know Memphis know right where it is. I suppose our equivalent is probably Mount Olivet, but it's a very large cemetery with a lot of Victorian markers in it. And she is buried there, as there's a whole section of yellow fever deaths that are people who died that are in this same cemetery. There's a section for yellow fever deaths. And the reason that this was so much worse in Memphis than any other place was that the city had terrible drainage and terrible sanitation. The city was in such a distress after this epidemic. They relinquished their charter for a little bit of time and were just a taxing district in Shelby County. The raw sewage was in the streets. It was the bayous, the tributaries of the Mississippi were filled with mosquitoes. Cisterns where people got their drinking water contaminated. Wells were contaminated. Most people drew their water from somewhere. It was a city that was on the brink, and the worst, in fact, did happen with this yellow fever epidemic in 1878. So finally, in the 1880s, the city decides we've got to clean the place up. Surely all of the refuse and sewage and everything else are having something to do with our health issues here in this city. And so they began installing a sewer system. There's been a lot of scholarly work done on the Memphis sewer system. So if any of you are interested in that, send me an email and I will send you some articles to read about the Memphis sewage system. But the city also dug really deep wells, and that helped a good bit. And so by the 1890s, Memphis had made the comeback that everybody expected or hoped for, but did not necessarily have faith would happen. They had clean water, no hogs or cattle running in the streets. Most of the streets were now paved. And guess what? The death rate in Memphis had been cut in half. Now, I'm going to talk about the Spanish flu epidemic here in just a minute, but I want to pause here before we get to that and say something about diphtheria, because diphtheria was, as other contagious diseases go, it was one of the big killers here in Nashville. Nashville had, at the same time Memphis is having this yellow fever epidemic, Nashville is having a diphtheria epidemic of a magnitude that this city had never seen before. And it really made the attention first of the Board of Aldermen here in Nashville when the people who lived once again around the city cemetery started complaining. They were afraid they were going to get sick from all the bodies that were being brought to the cemetery. You know, most cemeteries at this particular time had holding vaults, and the dead were put in holding vaults during the winter until the graves could be dug. And so it was a really, the Board of Aldermen finally shut down the cemetery. And when one man's son died of diphtheria, he paid the sexton of the cemetery to break the rules and go bury his son by the son's mother, the man's wife, who was already dead. And the sexton was fined by the Board of Aldermen for doing that. But our big epidemic came in 1918, and compared to what is going on today, this one was minuscule. It was nothing. Nashville was a thriving town. That's what our courthouse looked like. It had been designed by William Strickland's son, Francis Strickland. You see, we've got a few cars, we got a few horse-drawn carriages, and we have streetcars. Now, the minister at Moore Memorial Presbyterian Church, our mother church, had just come in May of 1918. He had come from Richmond, Kentucky, excuse me. And he stayed a little less than 2 years. He left and went to the First Presbyterian Church in Durham, North Carolina. He was very interested in foreign missions, but he no sooner gets to town and gets settled until this epidemic breaks out. But again, I want to emphasize that the magnitude was relatively small compared to now. And keep in mind that this is going on during the very same time that we are trying to bring World War I, the Great War, to an end. So the newspapers carried stories about the Spanish flu coming to Nashville, but they always minimized it because, as you're going to see from these articles from the Tennessean, that it did not make front page news for a good long period of time, even though it was spreading through the city. And so here we see Olin West. That's a familiar name to us. I assume he is related to the Olin West we know, who was the secretary of the city board of health. And he says it's just like having la grippe. It's some kind of ailment, but we don't need to worry about it too much. And then on September 29th, it's now in our city. Well, then it keeps staying on the back page because the people who run the paper and the city don't want people to have a panic about this flu epidemic because we've got to focus on the war effort. So here on September 30th, on page 26 in the Tennessean, you see that it's broken out at Old Hickory, which was where we had the most deaths. DuPont had come in and built this factory to make smokeless gunpowder. It was working at full production. All their staff, which were primarily young women and Hispanic workers, lived in the young women lived in what amounted to Army barracks or dormitories. And this area is going to be the worst hit with the epidemic. But here on September 30th, we're saying, no, we're taking precautions out there at the powder plant, nothing to worry about. And you see on all of these slides, the buy war bonds after pretty much every story in the Tennessean. The war wasn't won yet, and we were still focused on doing our part as civilians to win the war. So here it comes, and suddenly it's the next day, it's in all parts of the state. It doesn't make the front page until Wednesday, October 2nd, when we suddenly get shocked when it says the city hospital is full and turned away 50 people. Now, as fast as this came, it went. It really lasted only about, with intensity, about 2 weeks. The city asked for movie theaters to close. The churches voluntarily closed for about 2 weeks, including Moore Memorial. But other than that, things, as fast as it came, it went. The most casualties were people who worked out at that DuPont plant in Old Hickory because of the close proximity. You've also got to remember that we didn't run around so much in 1918. There weren't really restaurants to go to. There was probably 1 or 2 movie theaters downtown. People did go to the movies, they went to church, but they certainly didn't do recreational shopping of any kind at big box stores. They stayed pretty close to home. And so consequently, people weren't out and about. And the city was just such a very tiny, relative to Nashville today, the whole of Davidson County, such a tiny little part of Davidson County at this particular time. And it's pretty soon that they're talking about some kind of a serum that will prevent it, some kind of inoculation. We did see this rise and fall, but it happened very quickly. And then in 1919, we have another rise. It comes again, a second wave, but we dealt with this pretty well. Again, I give the University of Nashville and their medical school that ultimately became the Vanderbilt Medical School high credit for our ability to treat this Spanish influenza when it did come. And so here is a little poem that was written about the Spanish flu that I think we might apply to the flu we've got today. Flu? If we but knew the cause of flu and whence it comes and what to do, I think that you and we folks too would hardly get in such a stew. Do you? Now, I'm happy to take all the questions that you have. I'm happy to answer any questions, to hear your comments. I am not a microbiologist, so I really can't give you detailed information about the cause of these germs, but I will tell you this. I saw that Doug and Sarah Jane Mitchell had logged in here several years ago now. They were in a group of people that I led out on a tour of the Omohundra water treatment plant, which is over in Donaldson, where we take the water out of the Cumberland River and purify it and then send it out. And so it's actually on Elm Hill Pike. It's across from the Mount Olivet Cemetery. It's not as far out as Donaldson. But nonetheless, we went to the Omohundra treatment plant, and Doug was in with us. And Doug, who in his professional life was a gastroenterologist, was talking to the metro biologists out there, and the rest of us in this group were just mesmerized by the conversations. And I think everybody in that group came away from that trip saying, we've got great water in Nashville, because Metro has these biologists who are educated, who've worked for the city for 30 years. It's high security out there now. Since 9/11, there's a big fence, so you have to show an ID to get in. You can't just go out there and walk around anymore, but it really is quite an interesting sight. And it's very comforting to know that our drinking water that comes out of our taps is good. Now, I see Carol West saying, or Norm Carl saying that Carol West is her father-in-law. Okay, thanks, Norm. I'm glad to, I knew that Olin West had to be kin to our Olin West in some way or another.
And then we have a comment from Ellie Kuiper. And Ellie, you might want to unmute. Ellie is saying that it seems so obvious today that we need to control raw sewage. And she's wondering if there will be something in 100 years that is equally as obvious to people, like today's challenges over wearing masks or fill in the blank. Would you add to that comment and that observation that Ellie has made, Carol?
Well, I think that Ellie is absolutely right. What seems so commonplace today, people just didn't see the need of. I mean, there was a big debate in Nashville about having people keep their chickens and cows up. Why did people living in the city have cows? Well, it was before we had refrigeration. And if you didn't have ice from the Iceman, and so one of the big public health problems was that children in poor areas didn't get enough milk to eat because their families had no ice and they had no milk to drink. And that caused all manner of, childhood diseases, rickets and other things. And some things that seem so commonplace, this whole thing about diseases. One of the best books I've ever read is called Destiny of the Republic. Some of you, I'm sure, have read this book. It came out probably 10 years ago, but it's really about the death of President James Garfield, who was shot, but he lived about 4 or 5 months after he was shot. They couldn't find the bullet in his abdomen. And here you've got Alexander Graham Bell busy trying to invent something that will locate this bullet. He got so close, but it didn't happen. And the doctors would not wash their hands before they treated him. Over in England, we've got Dr. Lister talking about germ theory. Wash your hands, wash your hands, put on a mask when you do surgery. And the American doctors, we don't need that. We don't need that. And so imagine your doctor smoking a cigar and then sticking his hand in this hole in your abdomen trying to find a bullet with his hands. I mean, we can't imagine. That is beyond our realm of thought today. So we are lucky that we have so much knowledge built up a base, and we are lucky to live in a place like Nashville where we have access to excellent medical care.
I'm wondering if the baton you, in a way, started to throw to Doug Mitchell, and being with Doug and Sarah Jane on that Omohundra plant tour. Doug Mitchell, as a gastroenterologist and someone who's spent his entire life in medicine, how have you seen bacteria certainly impacts our gut, all these things. How have you seen things change? And as a physician, what are you thinking about not only Nashville's history or Tennessee's, as Carol has shared it, but where we are today as we struggle with our current pandemic?
You'll have to unmute Doug or Sarah Jane.
Am I live now?
You're live, Doug. I'm glad to hear your voice. I miss seeing you on my route to work every day.
I appreciate your talk very much, Carol. I think you hit a lot of really important things. And I knew a lot about the yellow fever because I had a strong interest in liver disease. And the reason it's called yellow fever is it's a viral illness that attacks your liver. And you get what's called acute yellow atrophy, and your liver just stops working. And then all the byproducts of breaking down red cells, the bilirubin builds up and you turn yellow and you die. And so I just wanted to make a plug for another book. If anybody's interested in this is one Sarah Jane got me, I think for my birthday, and it's called Mosquito. And it's have you seen it?
I've seen it, but I haven't read it.
It's outstanding. This guy is fascinated by what has happened with the mosquito. And he goes back to the Greeks and the Romans, and he talks about Alexander the Great, and he talks about all the things that happened. And he felt that the marshes, the Pontine marshes outside of Rome, protected them because all the Goths and the Visigoths would come down, they'd get bitten by the mosquitoes, and they had died before they could kill the Romans. And so it ties into your yellow fever thing here in Tennessee very, very, very much. Cholera, of course, was terrible. Cholera is a fascinating illness because the microorganism doesn't really invade. It just goes down into your gastrointestinal tract and takes over the mechanism. And so close your ears if you're squeamish, but it led to what they call rice water stools, because you had so much water and electrolytes going out into your digestive tract that it didn't look like stool anymore. It looked like rice water. And so a very, very fascinating thing that a man who used to live here in Nashville named Ken Brigham discovered when he was working with the Hopkins group in India is that in a place that doesn't have IV fluids and things like that, if you can give a balanced electrolyte solution and glucose, you can combat the effects of cholera and save the lives of children. So it's really fascinating to look at the things that you can learn that help you fight these things. And again, you got to believe in the germ theory. So
yeah, you got to believe in germ theory. Sylvia has just recommended another book called The End of Empathy. Maybe we should put together a list. Another book that comes to mind is that book about the epidemic in Memphis. I'm blanking on the name of it. It may just be influenza. There is a book called Influenza, but there's another book about the yellow fever epidemic. Now, Doug, did I exaggerate about the Omohundra water treatment plant?
It was fascinating. I mean, in the first place, some of these buildings out there, they were like a temple or like a church, and you just realize how important it was to these people that they would make the water treatment plant look so wonderful.
It's just beautiful.
Beautiful place and fascinating. And I completely agree with you that I used as a physician, I guess it was Paracelsus that said, God cures them and I just change the bandages. Well, as a physician, you sometimes are in that situation that it's really the engineers that take care of the clean water and take care of the sewers. That's what keeps us healthy. It's preventive medicine and public health, not your physician being a brilliant person. And that's where we are with this pandemic right now. In other words, maybe we're going to get vaccines. In fact, I went to see my doctor in March when all this was happening, and he was very astute. He says, we're not going to conquer this until we have vaccines and effective vaccines. So we're back to the days of public health. In other words, you've got to hide from the virus. You've got to stay away from where the virus is. And until we have better treatment, then public health, wash your hands, stay 6 feet apart, wear your mask. That's all we've got.
Seems pretty simple, doesn't it?
Carol, we've got a comment or two and a couple questions. Amy Dennison, you maybe picked up on when Carol said how the children in impoverished areas where the families didn't have cows and didn't have refrigeration, thus needed to get milk for the children's growth someplace else. And you're commenting that, of course, it's always the least fortunate who are most affected by disease, among so many other things. And as we talk about preventive medicine, public health, and the engineers who create the sewage treatment plants, et cetera, I'm reminded that most highways often go right near low-income housing areas, so that the respiratory diseases and other illnesses that put people at even more risk for COVID due to lung damage already is another illustration of what you are naming here, Amy, in your comment. Carol, would you like to respond to that at all?
Well, certainly I will, because Amy, you're exactly right. The poorest parts of town were the parts along the river. And there was an enormous Catholic community along the Cumberland River. That's why they built that St. Patrick's Church that's on 2nd Avenue for those Irish Catholics who had come in. They had large families. They did building and construction. They came to work on the first bridge over the Cumberland River, but they were always the hardest hit with every epidemic that came along. And the interstate comment that you made, Heidi, is really a subject for another entire discussion, or 2 or 3 or 4, about the costs of development. And as we are developing better housing in parts of Nashville, we're also pushing poor people out of their housing. And I was in a conversation, I guess yesterday, with Vice Mayor Schulman, who has this Zoom thing sometimes on Saturday. And that area where the city cemetery was a really bad, poor part of town. And now it's being gentrified, and all the poor people are being pushed out, but we're not providing them a place to live. And yet we keep building. And the African-American community really is very concerned about that. And we should have some conversations about the interstate system. I can make a lot of comments about that, which I'll refrain from, but it cut right through the poorest parts of town.
Mm-hmm. Carol, thank you for that. And to add to the comment, and I think the idea of a book list is really important. So know that we as a task force will see that that also gets up, along with the other resources in the Saturday email. That this book by Compton, The End of Empathy, focuses on the great social moral movements led by Christians in the 19th and early 20th century, and what Compton's seeing is a waning of empathy by Christians since that time. One might have talked about that in the early part as the social gospel movement, that in this waning empathy, it's culminated in the current lack of care of Christians for neighbor, including non-compliance with healthcare recommendations. And as you say, there's Sylvia, or perhaps Compton does, out of a selfish nature. Do you, Carol, see a lack of Christian care for others during this pandemic, such as refusal to wear masks, maintain distance, commitment to gather in church, sitting close together in large numbers, etc.?
Well, I see that in 2 or 3 different ways. First of all, sitting together in church in high density without a mask is just not smart at all. I will say that. And you know, we live in boxes. We have walls around ourselves, and we don't see what life is like in some parts of this city. And the place where you can see our poverty and our divisions the most is to go into any public elementary school in Davidson County that is in a relatively poor part of town. Those children are really the big victims of this epidemic, the living victims of this epidemic, when they can't go to school and their parents or grandparents, there's just often there's rarely a stable family situation for many of these children. And we as Christians often just, you know, it's like, I'll think about that tomorrow, because we don't know what to do. The magnitude of the problem is big, and we don't know what to do.
Well said, and certainly a challenge for us, yes? We move next to an observation or a sharing out of real life and a good question about two of the epidemics you spoke to from Zach Kuiper. Why is yellow fever, or from Ellie, I'm not sure if it's Ellie or Zach, why is yellow fever no longer an issue in the US? Is it as simple as mosquito prevention, or could it come back? We certainly know West Nile virus, right, has. What do you know about it from the past, and as we are concerned about any form of mosquito-borne illness like yellow fever in the present and future?
Well, I don't really, I mean, I think it is mosquito prevention primarily. Could it come back? Well, it could, the mosquitoes could, we'll have to read Doug's book, Mosquito, to find out if the biological evolution of mosquitoes is going to get them immune to one thing and start spreading it again. And, but mosquitoes, you know, some people in Nashville have their yards sprayed. Others don't think that, people feel that the spray is more dangerous than the mosquitoes. So even today we're divided about that subject because there are 2 or 3 companies that offer mosquito spraying in your yard. And, you know, something we haven't talked about, but really dangerous is ticks. And we haven't gotten to ticks out there in the environment. And then, you know, there's this whole environmental movement that says, what are we doing to our environment that's causing some of these biological animal problems to develop here? So there's a lot of science still out there for us to do.
I need to clarify, thanks to Ellie, but I do so with great joy. Number one, we've not only heard from Ellie in this session, but that was Zach's question. And what is so exciting to me as one of your pastors is so often we have more than one person on a screen. So sometimes I don't know if it's one or the other person with only one name. But Zach and Ellie, you're on separate screens. You're both engaged and you're speaking to us through chat. Thanks to both of you for engaging. Doug's trying to make a comment. Let's just share Maurice's observation. Maurice, you know this in your own life, that your mother was a victim to the diphtheria epidemic as a small child, and it settled in the mastoid bone in her ear, you're telling us, and then it had to be removed. The bone. Okay, when I read it first, I worried it was
not the ear.
So you just added the bone.
Yeah.
That's quite dramatic.
It just, I guess it was scary. But back to what Carol said about the school situation with the children being at home. I'm on the board of a charter school, and I was just hearing this week that it is very traumatic for some of the children at home in many, many ways. And this particular school is trying to stay on top of those children who might be in distress situations. But Carol, you are exactly right.
Maurice, thank you. Out of real life, both with your mom and with this nonprofit you're involved with, and knowing the school situation, giving a testimony to that dire problem, especially now. We have, first of all, if I might, it is 10:45, but Carol is very happy to stay with us. There have been more questions, and Doug Mitchell, I know, has alerted me he's ready to share a comment. So if you need to leave, please know we understand that. This is our normal Sunday school hour, though nothing's normal anymore, right, friends? So if you'd like to stay with us for a bit more time, we thank Carol for being willing to. So before, though, we move on to the questions and comments that have come in since, could we please share together a round of applause for Carol? You can hear mine.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
You feel it, Carol. You can see it.
I feel it. I do.
So I believe was the next one, Doug suggesting you were ready to make a comment. And then we have Paul and Curtis and Sylvia, I believe, in the queue.
Well, can you hear me?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. The two mosquitoes you need to worry about the most are the Aedes aegypti, and that's the one that transmits malaria. And then Anopheles is the one that does yellow fever. And we still have those mosquitoes around. We got control of that with extensive draining of the swamps, using DDT and this sort of thing. Then DDT got into the water and got into the fish, and then the eagles started eating it and their shells got very, very thin and so forth. So Rachel Carson and Silent Spring realized that was a bad thing, and so we banned all of that. But we do have the vectors still around, and as someone pointed out, we have Zika, and we have lots of mosquito-borne things that are still lurking. And so I don't think we want to be too sanguine that we've totally whipped all of this. And so I think, and your comments about the tick-borne illnesses, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and on and on and on, is very, very pertinent. So we just have to stay vigilant and realize that Mother Nature can be a bitch.
That's exactly right. Old Mother Nature.
Thank you, Doug. I think you just drew that one over the home plate, so that's great, or the outfield, whichever way that baseball's moving. Paul DeWitt, to you, Carol, has herd immunity developed to eradicate yellow fever? We know you're not a doctor, but you know a ton, Carol. You're one of our resident.
I don't think it's a herd immunity developed because there's still mosquitoes flying around spreading the disease. So being in a herd isn't going to that. Now, Doug can speak to that, or Curtis. I see Curtis is up here too. Maybe we should unmute. Let's unmute Curtis's mic and let Curtis speak to this subject, because he knows, he's a doctor too, like Doug, and maybe he can speak to this. Curtis, can you unmute your mic?
Yeah, I did, but I'm not an infectious disease guy.
I know.
But to say, I think Doug said it right. I think that if yellow fever was, well, if it was around and it was in a mosquito and you got bit, there's likelihood you'd get it. I don't know what the infectivity of it is, but I agree with him. I think it was primarily public health things that primarily eradicated it. It may have been eradicated from the population of mosquitoes, but I don't know enough. I don't know enough about the disease to know how immunity develops to it, or whether you can get immune to it. I don't think you can, but that's just my off the cuff comment. And Doug probably knows more about this than I do. So,
well, speak to the climate change comment that you made, Curtis.
Well, what it speaks to is that no question Lyme disease is on the rise. The ticks that bear it, their population will increase, and the range over which they work will increase as the temperature warms. Mm. The thing is that doesn't say how climate change affects how ticks affect us. Also, a lot of these diseases exist, for example, Ebola, et cetera, exist in animal reservoirs when they're not infecting us. And so, climate change will affect animals, particularly our domesticated ones, and probably make, like the coronavirus, other viruses that are not infecting us at the moment likely to infect us. Mm-hmm. Now, that's all conjecture. It's hard to prove this, but clearly, this is a quantifiable. This is a kind of an unquantifiable risk at the moment, though it is certainly there and could be, I put it higher than the idea of an asteroid hitting the Earth, but it's out there.
So Curtis, and many of you participated in the compelling session on October 18th that Curtis and the folks from the Citizens Climate Lobby led. Thank you again, Curtis, for that. You're reminding us of the interface, right, between human health, the creation's health, global health, animals, the whole works. If we didn't have a global economy and airplanes, right, we might not have had some of the viral transmission. I mean, so much that has changed in our world has aided the transmission of virus, right? Including climate change and how the world has evolved. I wonder if, before we go to Sylvia Lyon's comment, that we just ask if our resident, very wise microbiologist, Rosemary Verrill, who on my screen is to Curtis's left, is there anything you'd like to add? Because this is a field you do have some real knowledge about.
She does.
Rosemary?
Well, I do about certain things, but tropical medicine is not one of my strong points. But influenza, I do have feelings about. But I I think everything's been covered very well.
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you for your service in that Vanderbilt lab for so many years, and our doctors on the call and our other healthcare providers. Sylvia is giving great testimony. So I had to read in the middle. This is your dad? So, born in a cabin on the old Civil War battlefields of Dover, Tennessee, your dad's family believed a creek running through the cattle pastures only needed to cross over 12 stones before the water was safe to drink. And as a result, yeah, look at Doug reacting there. There are many young children in your family cemetery there. Wow, Sylvia, there's another real life story about how these epidemics have impacted. Carol, that sits with, and that's a Tennessee story too, Dover, Tennessee.
That is. I was just thinking about that. Dover, Tennessee. I'm sure that creek flowed right into the Cumberland River there, where Fort Donelson's National Battlefield is. So it's a very rural part of the state. It's near here, but it's near, but in other ways, Dover is 5,000 miles from Nashville. So it's a very poor community today. And some of those little towns over there in West Tennessee, which aren't really so far from here, Houston County, it's a very poor county too. Erin is the county seat, I think, of Houston County.
So Dover, Tennessee, I'm revealing I don't know my state well enough. It's West Tennessee. I'm reminded that our food drive on December 5th is for folks who are very hungry in the rural counties of East Tennessee. And as we look at the epidemiological maps of the country, right, we are seeing rising spikes in cases of coronavirus in rural areas. And as you may know, our Living Waters for the World team puts in water filtration systems for people who still don't have clean water to drink in Macon County.
Yeah, and Macon County is the county, if you go straight up I-65, Macon is just to the left, to the right of Sumner County. So it's not so far.
All right.
We also have here, Susan, I'm just trying to help you mute there. Dorch Oldham to everybody, and probably Carol was on that screen with a lot of clapping, joining. Lokeel and Joe Gaines, wonderful and enlightening discussion. And it's Joe Gaines who is leading the way for the food drive on the 5th. And again, from Lokeel and Joel, what a creative response. I am asking for a purple Martin house for Christmas. They eat mosquitoes. So whether that's Lokeel's request or yours, Joe, one of you better fulfill it for the other. And maybe the rest of us will follow suit. Am I seeing Doug raising his hand?
Go for dragonflies. They're much better at eating mosquitoes than purple martins. Purple martins get all the press, but it's a dragonfly you want. My book helped me on this.
Well, who is Dones? I'm not sure I know who.
Am I missing Dones? I'm not seeing that.
At the very bottom.
Ah, okay, there it is. Thanks from feel free to acknowledge. Yellow fever, let's name the comment, and if you'd like to unmute yourself, feel free, because we're not recognized. Yellow fever, still around, 2016 outbreak in Angola. It spread to the Democratic Republic of Congo, and there was a shortage of a vaccine. Virus found in tropical and subtropical area of Africa and South America. So a contemporary witness to what is going on, and we know refugee camps, right? Isn't cholera continues to be a challenge?
Yes.
Dee Owens, would you like to speak?
Okay, that's probably a good idea.
Well, I'm not sure if we're accessing that person.
Everything else, I think.
But how important, and isn't that a big piece of what the Clinton Foundation, or Carter Center, excuse me, I meant to say Carter Center, a very good friend of ours when we lived in Atlanta, was part of the Carter Center and took care of Guinea worm disease in countries like Burundi, where because of a lack of sanitation and clean water, and guinea worm disease is pretty horrific, friends, it was still afflicting many. Did we happen to access that good friend who sent in that great observation? I guess not. Well, thank you for enlightening us about contemporary viral challenges and epidemics. Anyone else want to unmute and share directly? And I think we would invite you, Carol, to have the last word. Give us, you're a woman of faith. You are the Davidson County historian. You teach 4 classes. I find that mind-boggling for those of us who are married to professors who teach in other places. You have a huge course load and at Volunteer State. And you are our beloved historian here. You've even helped us with the history of the church as we bring in new members. So as a woman of faith and a historian, please share a word that we can take with us as we seek to be faithful in this time.
I will use the words of Carrie Chapman Catt as we close. Now, these were given in a very different circumstance, but when it looked like the suffragists were not going to get the 19th Amendment ratified 100 years ago, Carrie Chapman Catt said there's only one thing we have left that we can do, and that is pray. And I think on a serious note that is what we have to do, is pray that we will have the wisdom to do what is right to help people that we see in need, and that we will have the courage to find empathy with people who we may find less desirable.
Friends, I think we just heard a benediction that we would continue to go forth as God's praying people, listening for God's call to action, praying that God would give us the wisdom to do what is right, the courage to be there for all who are vulnerable and in need. Yes? And that we would go forth as God's people to love God with all our heart and soul, mind and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. All our neighbors, friends, go forth in peace and love and joy. Carol, thank you for the gift of today. Thanks for gifting us to go forth stronger as God's people. Thank you all. Have a great day and a great Thanksgiving week in whatever manner you celebrate. May God bring to you the power of gratitude to hold you up. Thanks be to God. Amen.